Welcome to The Burning Question with your hosts Pamela Segneri and Paul Tothill. The Burning Question, where we ask the questions no one wants to answer.
Welcome to The Burning Question, where we ask the questions that no one wants to answer. I'm Pamela Segneri.
And I'm Paul Tothill, and our guests today are Dr. Robert Moles, previous Associate Professor of Law at the University of Adelaide, an author, and now devotes his time to his site Networked Knowledge. And he continues to champion the causes of alleged serious miscarriages of justice. And Faye, Hambour, who has worked with Dr. Moles on these issues.
And the burning question for today is justice really justice?
That's a great question, Pam.
Of course it is.
I mean, I know that lots of the people watching today have a sense and idea of justice. But Dr. Moles, if I can start with you, what is justice? I mean, we've got all these ideas. Is there a framework we can try and define justice within?
Justice essentially is treating people fairly, treating them in accordance with the well-publicised rules that operate in society. And in our particular context, it's the operation of the criminal justice system. And for that to work properly, it's essential that a whole range of people, police and prosecutors, defence lawyers, judges, all act in accordance with the rules that govern their conduct. And so a miscarriage of justice involves some key failure at some point in that system.
So the idea of justice in the criminal justice system is a trial according to law. Would that be right?
Yeah, well, the rule of law is an essential component of a civilised society. And that means that we identify and deal with the people who have committed serious crimes, and we ensure that innocent people are not inadvertently caught up in the system and punished inappropriately.
And that's the key, innocent people.
Absolutely.
And Faye, what's your view of justice? I know that you've had a sliding view, if I can say, of justice. Where did you start with the idea of justice for you? What's justice? If I were to ask you before you learnt some new things.
Like Bob said, to me it was fairness, and it was a truth-seeking industry, purpose to keep us safe and to make sure that our members of society were held to account. And I truly believed that was the way our system operated, that it was entirely truth-seeking and that it dealt with the alleged perpetrator fairly, because one of the other things I held very close to my heart was that the system was fair, that everyone got a fair trial. Because even though I knew that, obviously villains needed to be taken to trial and punished if found guilty, I truly believed in a system that made sure that they got a fair hearing, and I learnt otherwise.
Okay, so you heard Dr. Moles speak, and he shared some of his research and background, and that provoked something in you.
It did.
What happened there?
Well, I actually, fairly early on into Bob's talk, it was probably only 15 minutes into his miscarriages of justice talk, my skeleton was rattling because I had disturbed some very long and closely held beliefs that we in South Australia had a very robust justice system that was entirely truth-seeking, and that if a mistake was made, I had believed it would have been corrected quick smart.
Okay.
And Bob had shown me during that course of that talk that that wasn't necessarily the case.
Now, Bob, you've written quite extensively on this very subject, miscarriages of justice. So the idea of is justice justice, you've addressed that through the criminal justice system. What are some of the topics you've written on? You've written textbooks and those kinds of things?
Yes, of course. We've produced 4 books over the last number of years. 2 of them are case-based books which look at individual cases and explain why we say that they're serious miscarriages of justice. And the other 2 are regarded as national and international textbooks on the law on miscarriages of justice. One was published in Canada in 2010. The other was published by a major law publisher in Australia in 2015. And the reason that we have to do that is because when we're suggesting that there have been serious miscarriages of justice, we're actually putting forward the proposition that the system has fundamentally failed in some respect. And of course, there are a lot of people out there who would be unwilling to accept that that could be true. So what we have to do is bridge that credibility gap. And we have to say, look, we are worthy of being listened to. What we say makes sense because we've published these books by major publishers and they don't publish these things without checking them and making sure that they've got sound content. We have eminent lawyers who have contributed to the books or written supporting things about them. And we've also, over the years, done quite a number of television and radio programmes. At the moment, it's over 100 such programmes that we've done, all to build credibility in the community, to help the community to understand that we do have a serious problem that needs to be fixed.
Yeah.
So would it be fair to say that when these cages are being rattled, that makes us feel unsafe? Because justice, as you said, Faye, we feel safe in the knowledge that the system is doing the right thing. And then when someone says, oh no, hey, what about this? I all of a sudden feel unsafe. I can't trust the system. I can't trust the whoever's that are all a part, the judges, the lawyers, the police, the forensic pathologists or whoever. I can't trust in that. So that people don't want to know, really, do they?
Well, that's true, and that's why my background, I think, was important to the work that I do. I did my law degree in Belfast during the 1970s, what were called the Troubles. And I saw at first hand what happens when the legal system isn't working properly and when it's not trusted. People take the law into their own hands. People would, their doorbell would ring in the evening, they'd answer the door, open the door, and somebody would just shoot them dead. They'd put bombs under cars if people were doing the wrong things and so on. So I realised, of course, as I went off to the university to study law, because I realised how centrally important it was to our sense of security. I had the privilege of going to Edinburgh University to do a PhD. So by the time I ended up in South Australia and saw a legal system that was in distress, I realised that something had to be done. Because in a sense, some people had been misled into thinking that the system's working well when in fact it isn't. So that needs to be dealt with. But at the same time, we need to be reassured that we can fix the system and put it right and give people the security that they really want to have.
There are, of course, inherent checks and balances in courts of review, appeal courts. And of course, one of the premises is they are able to overturn a conviction if there's been a miscarriage of justice. There is a measure of integrity, surely, in the system to ensure that the convictions are safe.
Oh, it's very important that we do have those checks and balances. When the police go to the prosecutors and say, we think this person's committed a crime, here's the evidence. The prosecutors have to scrutinise that very carefully and say, well, have you properly established the case? Are there any holes in it? And when the prosecutors go to court and say, we think you're guilty of a serious crime, the defence lawyers should come in and look at that very carefully. The judge should be saying, is this a trial according to the rules of law? Is the person getting a fair trial? All of these things work. So in a sense, when we have a serious miscarriage of justice, it's not just that one person has failed, it's that the system has failed. And before it becomes a true miscarriage of justice, they've not only got to be wrongly convicted, but they've then got to have an appeal that's unsuccessful. That's really the point at which I then begin to take an interest in these claims.
We're going to go for a commercial break. But we're going to come back because this is very interesting, so we'll see you in a moment.
The use of timber in your home creates a warmth that can't be surpassed by any other material. Solid timber complements almost every texture and colour. Let Lemex Timber show you the warmth of Australian oak, the richness of real Baltic pine, the strength of Jarrah, or the soft look of Tasmanian oak. In flooring, stairs, furniture or fireplaces, nothing can come close to the look of natural solid timber from Lemex. Lemex, the solid timber specialists. Bedford Street, Port Adelaide.
The Burning Question with your host Pamela Segneri and Paul Tothill.
Welcome back. Now, Paul, we've already touched on a whole lot of subjects. How about we go to the presumption of innocence? Because I always thought that was the rule of thumb.
Well, Faye, first of all, to you, how important is the presumption of innocence? I mean, to the society, should we be presumed innocent until we're found guilty?
I believe we should be, but in reality I don't think that often happens, because I think many of us, and I have to put my own hand up for this, can be very quick to judge. And with the media, as rapid fire as it is, and the extensive types of media that exist today, I think we often jump to very rapid conclusions, and our desire to maintain, to believe in the maintenance of innocence until proven guilty, I think is often overlooked.
So, for example, there's been an arrest, media headline, man arrested, we all go, oh, whew, that one's put away, and we get stunned if the whole process and the evidence doesn't turn out consistent with the reasonable suspicion around the arrest.
Yeah.
So something must have gone wrong. They weren't found guilty. So we have a presumption of innocence in one sense in our legal process, but we don't have a presumption of innocence in our mindset as a society until it's us.
Unless, I was going to say, unless it's about us.
Then we want the presumption of innocence.
Yeah.
Or our loved ones.
Everyone else is guilty until it comes to us being in a situation. Then we want everything to work in our favour. Dr. Moles, I mean, obviously in your area of miscarriages of justice, how do we approach the idea after an appeal of the presumption of innocence? Let's say, for example, there has been a miscarriage, a substantial miscarriage of justice, and the conviction is set aside. What happens then? If there's no retrial, what status does the person have?
Okay. Look, the first thing we have to look at is when assessing these cases is what actually happened at the trial. And if we can satisfy ourselves that in some way the trial wasn't conducted according to the proper rules, then of course the person is entitled to have their convictions set aside. And very often the appeal court will set convictions aside when many people in the community would be absolutely confident that they were correctly and properly convicted. That's a good sign of a properly working legal system.
Yep.
When the conviction is set aside, of course, then there's a choice that the court has. It can either order a retrial or it can order a verdict of acquittal. If they enter a verdict of acquittal, there cannot be any further trial. And that will happen in certain circumstances where it was felt that the evidence at trial just wasn't sufficient to warrant a guilty verdict, or where there was some fundamental error at trial. Because to put a person on trial again in those circumstances would offend against the rule of double jeopardy. But if there was some slip, if there was something that just didn't work out properly during the course of a trial, the sort of mistakes that people could legitimately make, then it's only right and proper that the person goes back on trial again and we do it correctly and we fix up those mistakes.
And so there is a process that the Superior Court involves in. And let's say, for example, the Director of Public Prosecutions in a serious matter decides, well, we're not going to prosecute again for various reasons, and there are various reasons that make it inappropriate to retry the matter. Then what is the status of that person? The conviction's been set aside.
In law, it's quite clear, and this was set out very clearly in the Lindy Chamberlain case, for example, because a lot of people thought that she, in fact, was guilty of the terrible crime that she was accused of. The conviction was set aside. And the judges in that case said, look, it's very clear. The basic rule of our system is that when a conviction has been set aside, a person is restored to a presumption of innocence. That means that they're regarded in law as being innocent without having to prove it. They have exactly the same status then as all the rest of us. We all have a presumption of innocence. And we actually think it's important for us. And we should also think it's important for them when a conviction has been set aside.
I would bounce out of that and say that, a lot of people probably don't know that. They probably don't realise that there being a conviction set aside, that they're allowed to have that presumption of innocence. I suspect because of what we were talking about, where you go, well, hang on a second, they actually haven't been proven innocent. I mean, that's just wrong thinking, isn't it?
Sometimes people will say, but the person only got off on a technicality, but really we know that they're guilty. The answer is, of course, that you couldn't possibly know whether they're guilty or not. You haven't sat through the trial, you haven't listened to all of the evidence as the members of the jury had done, and you're not fully informed about the relevant rules of procedure, which you ought to be if you're going to make a judgment like that. I must say that in all the cases of miscarriages of justice that we've identified, I don't think there's any case in which I could say the jury got it wrong. I think in all of the cases I've looked at, I would say, if I'd been a member of the jury, I would have convicted the person too. It's just that they were given false or misleading information, or that there was some other reason for which the trial wasn't conducted properly. When those things arise, then of course the verdict must be set aside, the person must be restored to their presumption of innocence, and then if you as a society want to come at it again, you must then conduct the trial afresh and do it according to the proper rules.
So when we interact from the idea of what is justice, it seems like there's lots of different layers to the question, and there's lots of different approaches we can have to answering the question. Would that be right?
Yes.
And if we don't know the system, if we don't understand how the rules of evidence work, for example, and we were having a chat previously, for example, about the rules of evidence that allow certain evidence to be led. Not all evidence is able to be led. Remember what your response to that was? You were a bit dismayed.
I was, and I was offended. I really was. I was quite confronted by the fact that facts could be withheld from being presented at trial. And the point is, and I don't think I was an orphan here, that I actually had, prior to listening to Bob's speech, I had no direct contact with the law or any trial cases. So I was very much an outsider, just believing in something that was out there somewhere. And it's not until, you know, we get closer to the topic and the subject that we are confronted by misconceptions that we perhaps had held, or just by a lack of knowledge, full stop. And I suffered from that. And, you know, when I actually had the scales lifted from my eyes, I was pretty upset, because I'd realised that I had major deficiencies in my knowledge.
Yeah, naturally so. We're going to take a short commercial break, and we're going to come back. We're going to talk about some of the cases that, you know, these are facts that you have on record that Faye's au fait with, and we'll come back in a moment.
The use of timber in your home creates a warmth that can't be surpassed by any other material. Solid timber complements almost every texture and colour. Let Limex Timber show you the warmth of Australian oak, the richness of real Baltic pine, the strength of Jarrah, or the soft look of Tasmanian oak. In flooring, stairs, furniture or fireplaces, nothing can come close to the look of natural solid timber from Limex. Limex, the solid timber specialists. Bedford Street, Port Adelaide.
The Burning Question with your hosts Pamela Segneri and Paul Tothill.
Welcome back. Now, Faye, we've had a few talks, and I thought one of the things you said was so hilarious, because one of the cases that we obviously are talking about here is Henry Keogh. And when you first knew of Henry, what did you say?
I pegged him as guilty. And Henry Keogh's case was one of the cases given top billing by Bob's talk. And I have to admit my failing, because I had believed that Henry Keogh was guilty. I actually didn't want to hear Bob Mole's talk on miscarriages of justice, promoting the Keogh case as a top miscarriage of justice. Well then, having listened to Bob, I was very confronted by the fact that he said these cases exist. Henry Keogh's case is a miscarriage of justice, and thankfully I was stuck in the chair and convicted by my belief that he was guilty. And I thought, I have to do something about this. I can't turn from this and believe and just pretend that I have not heard what I've heard. So I raced to Bob at the end of his talk and said, I will do whatever you would like me to do. I'm not computer literate, I have no legal background, but just put me to work doing the, the hack work of the types of investigations that Bob was doing. And so he took me into his office and he said, sort out the Henry Keogh files. And it didn't take me long. I mean, there was a lot of reading. He said, just make sure only one sheet of paper remains. As I read and sat at Bob's feet and asked questions, I knew that I had it, all asked about. It was wrong.
But that was strictly from what you'd seen and heard in the media.
It was. And, I had believed that I was a person who was not a quick person to judge, that I was a considered person, that I was, you know, a person who made inquiry, who asked questions.
Fair-minded.
Just.
Thinking.
Yeah, and it was because you know, my core belief was that I valued justice. And so, you know, I believed I was coming to the right conclusion, but I didn't, and I admitted that I didn't. But I did say to Bob that, you know, I will do whatever you ask of me, but do not ever ask me to visit Henry Keogh in jail. Because I won't do it. And we'll find out about that more later.
And remember I said that, yeah, I'm sure you'll be present at his little party that we have when he gets released, and you looked at me in horror.
I did.
There's quite a human element, isn't there? I mean, we can talk conceptually and principles, but it's the human element, isn't it, in the fabric of society, that these issues really start to burn, and they really outplay. I mean, your emotion, your idea of your sense of justice, misplaced.
Yes.
That must have been, what the heck? What the heck? Hang on a second. If I can get this wrong, then what else have I got wrong? How else have I judged things incorrectly? And I mean, and there's a human toll, isn't there?
Yeah, Paul, you're right. And there was all of those things. I was very rattled by what I'd heard, and the only way I could settle it in myself and sort of, I guess, start correcting the wrongs that I was realising I was holding was by doing something positive and proactive. Because, you know, as a member of the community, I had no reason to come across the law or to be involved, and so I felt really impotent at the time. But by offering to help Bob, I at least felt I could settle my sins.
And at the same
Redemption.
time, answer that question in your own mind about, was my initial thought right, or are these new thoughts correct? And I need to work it out. I can see you going through that process of, is what he's telling me really correct or not? I need to have a look at that, and it's good that you did, because you were able then to sort of balance off your previous views against your later views and work out where the right of it was, you see.
But I drew a lot on Bob's sensibility too, because, you know, you can see just by the way he's talking, he's very measured, he's very calm, he's very knowledgeable. And so I benefit enormously, and it was part of my healing and my redemption, as you mentioned. I needed to be vindicated. I was able to ask a lot of questions, and I realised that one of the flaws in my coming to the conclusion that Henry Keogh was guilty was that I hadn't had the opportunity to ask questions. I'd taken in what the media had printed, I'd taken in the gossip, and there was an awful lot of gossip. I'd taken that on board, and I didn't have that capacity or the facility to ask questions of people who could have given me, you know, the right answer, because you know, the answer has to come from an authority, and I was able to get that from Bob.
Do you think it's a fair statement that for most of the community, justice doesn't become an issue? We want it, and we want to feel secure in it, and we need to know there's security in the system. But really, we're not confronted with the ins and outs of it until something happens in and around our life.
That's right.
Whether we're a victim, or we know somebody that's a victim, or somebody is an offender.
Yes.
In some way now that the criminal justice system comes alive to us. Bob, do you do much talking to community groups to help inform them and give understanding to these very things we're talking about?
I do a good deal of that, and part of the reason for that is because I'm firmly of the belief that the legal system isn't owned by the lawyers or even by the politicians, but it's actually our legal system. Us as members of the community need to take a sense of possession and ownership of these issues. And so I think it's very important to go out to talk to many different community groups and people of all different ages to have them informed and to try and engender the sort of reaction that Faye had. Not because you want to browbeat them or anything, but you just want them to question, get engaged. Because the Lord Chief Justice of England came out to a conference in Sydney not so long ago, and during the course of his speech he said the prospect of the legal system convicting an innocent person of a serious crime represents a catastrophic failure of the legal system. And that's perfectly correct.
That's a strong comment.
How many people would stand in the face of a catastrophe and do nothing? Very few, I would suggest.
That's right.
So all I'm trying to do is to say to these people, The legal system, because I've had the fortune to be trained and have some insight into how it works, has not done its job properly. I'd like you to know about that, because I'd like you to do something about it and try and put it right.
And Dr. Moles, we can learn our lessons from the UK, for example.
Absolutely.
And if you can touch briefly on some of the examples that were in the UK, some famous cases, and what it led to the inquiry and overturning of convictions through those inquiries.
In the UK, they established a criminal review commission round about the time that I was starting up our own process here in South Australia. Over that equivalent period of time, the Criminal Review Commission in England has been responsible for referring cases back to the Court of Appeal, and that has led to 420 convictions being overturned, mostly for serious crimes, and that actually includes 4 cases in which the people who were convicted were hanged after they'd been convicted. They'd had their crimes overturned.
That's pretty scary stuff, which we'll come back and talk some more about. But we're going to bring another guest on in a moment, and we'll be back right after these breaks.
The use of timber in your home creates a warmth that can't be surpassed by any other material. Solid timber complements almost every texture and colour. Let Limex Timber show you the warmth of Australian oak, the richness of real Baltic pine, the strength of Jarrah, or the soft look of Tasmanian oak. In flooring, stairs, furniture or fireplaces, nothing can come close to the look of natural solid timber from Limex. Limex, the solid timber specialists. Bedford Street, Port Adelaide.
The Burning Question with your hosts Pamela Segneri and Paul Tothill.
And our new guest is Henry Keogh. Now, Henry has experienced the processes of the criminal justice system with respect to a charge of murder. And after 20 years, the conviction has been set aside. After 20 years, you're a champion.
Thank you.
Come on, tell us, that's mind-blowing. I can't imagine.
Looking back on it, I sometimes struggle myself, to be honest. I do.
Yeah. And the question that we're talking about today is justice really justice? So, clearly...
Look, that's a huge issue, Pam. Justice is very subjective.
Yeah.
I think we all have an innate sense of what justice is. And we quite often want it, but we don't always readily extend it. The lines for that move, like goalposts. If you're playing, the best analogy I can think of is sport.
Yeah.
If all the decisions are going one team's way, your sense of fairness and justice is offended and you're outraged. Unless, of course, you're on the winning side.
Well, that's right. I mean, if it's your team,
but
Paul.
If it's all fair, but if it isn't, it's all up for grabs.
Yes, yeah. And that shouldn't be the basis of our society, should it?
No, but I think, Henry, as we've been discussing in the previous segments, there is this idea of justice that is innate, as you say, and there is an idea, there's a framework within our legal system that preserves and protects, shields those values that we say we hold to. But of course, there are representations through each player within the system that make that work. That would be correct.
Oh, totally. I think whenever you've got human beings in a system, no matter how well it's framed and maybe sort of regulated, as soon as you introduce a human element, flaws will creep in. We all have our own set of preconceptions that we sort of filter everything through, and we'll all have good days and bad days. Even with the most ethical person that you have, if they're tired, overworked, or have family issues, there's going to be slippage. And they're not going to do necessarily the best that they're capable of. And if you're the client or the opposition, you wear the consequences.
Yeah. So in the makeup of your journey, obviously you had 20 years as part of a sentence that was opposed. Of course, the conviction's been set aside, and you're entitled to the presumption of innocence now. The process for you obviously must have been very difficult at first to go through the emotional transition of you believing completely that you were innocent, being found guilty, and now into a prison system and in a process of sentencing. Is there an emotional element to that?
Undoubtedly. I had the naive belief, and I held on to that for the first 5 or 6 years, that regardless of those intermediate outcomes, like the 2 trials and then the unsuccessful appeals, that at least the High Court, the last recourse available to someone that's been convicted, they would set the record straight. I still had this ultimate and naive belief that the truth would prevail, and even though there were errors before, it would be fixed. But what I didn't understand at that stage was that the High Court's only a court of review. They cannot and won't entertain new evidence. So I was snookered.
So the introduction of the new legislation in South Australia, of which Dr. Moles was significantly involved, and he's been significantly involved in your case, created a forum now for new evidence to be introduced, and on that basis the conviction was set aside. Is that correct?
Correct.
Now, I just want to talk a little bit about the idea of justice within the sentencing process, because there is an assumption that, well, if you do the crime, you do the time. And the second assumption is, well, there's lots of people in jail that say they're innocent. What's your experience? You want to comment about those things?
Sure. I'll handle the second one first. You hear it time and time again, they all say that. They all claim that they're innocent. Well, let me set the record straight. The majority of them don't. What you'll find is that they'll, almost to a man, bar those who are sort of, prepared to sort of just cop it sweet, most of them will say, no, they'll fight it all the way. And then as soon as they're found guilty, okay, they'll put their hand up, sweet, you got me, no problem. A very small percentage will continue to protest their innocence. And what you'll find is, it might be 5, 10% of people post-conviction will still maintain an innocent stance. So that myth that's put out there is exactly that. It's a myth. It's a saying that people have grabbed onto and just keep perpetuating. And it's not true. It's totally inaccurate.
But that makes us feel safe, doesn't it? That the system is indeed working, so they're all saying that.
Well,
so
we're talking about a small percentage.
Well, it's a significant percentage, because as the actual number of prisoners grows, that 10% in real terms grows. And it's not just the people themselves who are in jail.
No.
It's their families. And it's the other side of the equation too. The people who were a victim of a crime. They don't get closure. If it wasn't that person, who was it?
Yeah.
What did happen? And so it's a huge ripple effect. It's not just a percentage. We're talking about real lives here.
Yeah, and that's the point, isn't it? That this is a human interaction. Society interacts. Crime is a part of human interaction. There are family implications in every measure and every step of the journey, isn't there?
Yes.
And for you, I mean, how did you approach it when you ultimately went to see Henry? You were never going to go and see Henry, but you ultimately did. The personal element behind the study, how did that impact you?
Tell them about the dogs in the car.
It affected me enormously because, as I said, when I first heard of Henry's case, I was just a housewife and just reading the local paper. But when I stepped forward and offered to help Bob Moles, I was basically motivated by the belief that the system was wrong. I wasn't motivated by Henry's innocence, or my belief of his innocence, because that was yet to come. When I realised that he had been wronged, my heart softened, and of course I was driven by my head, because it wasn't an emotional thing. I had researched his case by way of the tasks that Bob had set me. So I visited Henry, reluctantly initially, and it was a terrifying experience. I'd only seen razor wire on television. I hadn't seen it glistening up close, and I was confronted by it and really quite nervous. And I was going to meet then a convicted killer in jail. And that wasn't on my to-do list.
Not on your bucket list.
No, it wasn't. And yet, quite interestingly, Henry and I hit it off at the first meeting and enjoyed each other's company. And of course he's a human being, and why would I expect otherwise? And we just had a really engaging and fun first visit. And then, I decided quite quickly that he, like many other people, and he's not an isolated case, but I wasn't taking on the world. I was just taking on the Henry Keogh case, and I could see that he richly deserved to have visitors, and his visit list had dropped off dramatically. So I became, a visitor of reasonable regularity.
It's such a cute story. We're going to have a break and we'll come back and we'll hear some more about you two.
The use of timber in your home creates a warmth that can't be surpassed by any other material. Solid timber complements almost every texture and colour. Let Limex Timber show you the warmth of Australian oak, the richness of real Baltic pine, the strength of Jarrah, or the soft look of Tasmanian oak. In flooring, stairs, furniture or fireplaces, nothing can come close to the look of natural solid timber from Limex. Limex, the solid timber specialists. Bedford Street, Port Adelaide.
The Burning Question with your hosts Pamela Segneri and Paul Tothill.
Welcome back. You have no idea what goes on while you're watching a commercial break. We have been all over the place and we're trying to find the most interesting threads to bring to you. So Paul, over to you.
Search and see. So Henry, obviously the process that you spoke about took a long time.
Yep.
And in your sense of justice, is the process and the equipping of resources and the ability to instruct people adequately part of the idea of justice for people?
Look,
I mean, do you need to be properly represented and well represented?
You are, but access to your solicitors and counsel can be extraordinarily difficult. You might have 20 or 40 men, or sometimes more in really big jails, competing for 1 or 2 phones. And depending on how big the unit is, your phone call might be restricted to 5 minutes. If you ring through, he's in a conference, can you wait? I'll put you on hold. Your 5 minutes gets gobbled up.
Yeah.
So you have access that way. Visits few and far between because they've got busy caseloads. So access for information to them, instructions to, and information from them in terms of progress, it's a nightmare.
Yeah. So do you, is in your sense, and Faye, maybe we can ask you as well, I mean, would that be part of a fair trial, being able to adequately instruct your solicitors and get information and exchange information and be resourced?
Yes. And again, a real eye-opener for me, because I assumed wrongly, my bucket of wrong assumptions was very heavy. When I found out what Henry had been through, and including others, of course, I was shocked and again upset by the fact that it seemed cumbersome and it didn't seem to be working fairly, slickly enough that you would be receiving the correct amount of counsel and contact that I assumed you would be.
So Henry, we all see these images on the television programs of how the legal profession rolls and those kinds of things. I know that's drama. How far away from real life are those dramas?
Almost 180 degrees on occasion.
Yeah.
Even when you go to court appearances, you're held in holding cells below the courts. You're not brought up until 10-15 minutes before your matter comes on, and you may or may not get 1 or 2 minutes with your solicitor before you go on. Free and easy access is, a thing of Hollywood. You rarely get it.
And what does that instill in you as a person in a very serious process?
Enormous anxiety. You feel helpless, you're frustrated, and you feel completely impotent to have any influence over the outcome.
Did you ever feel a time in the whole process that you just felt you weren't being heard? That although everyone was doing their best, you weren't...
Constantly. And often, I mean, I can't speak for everybody, but one of my biggest issues was, in an information vacuum, I started to imagine all sorts of scenarios, and often, the longer that time went, the darker those scenarios went. So you start imagining all sorts of things. And it's not until you actually get some contact and you can find out, yes, look, matters are progressing, we've gotten these statements, we're getting this report, then at least you know that something is happening. But most of the time you think and feel as though you've just been forgotten until you get dragged into court for another arraignment. Well, not another arraignment, just another appearance.
Yeah. And that kind of, there's nothing just about that, because they're still human beings. And it doesn't really matter whether you're innocent. I mean, of course, it matters more if you're innocent. But if you're guilty, you're still a human being. And you still need to be treated as a human being, surely.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting question that I'm sure the viewers may differ on. They might say, well, you know, you've committed the crime, you know, we don't want to make it too soft for you. I mean, what would you say about that?
But doesn't the punishment and the treatment have to be commensurate with society's values?
Yes.
I'm not sure if it was Mandela, but someone said, if you want to see what a society's like, look at how they treat their prisoners. That is a measure of their intrinsic values and how they hold human life and dignity.
How little we value it.
Yeah.
So would you say then that this idea of justice that we're discussing also has to look at the way in which prisoners are being dealt with, the processes with the people that are charged with crimes? And of course, there's also got to be consideration, doesn't there, for the other side, for the victim and the victim's family.
Sure.
Of course.
I mean, obviously, there's all of those dynamics that are working. Do you want to comment about that, Henry?
Well, often I feel, no matter what issue you look at through history, where there's an imbalance, to try and correct it, we swing the complete opposite, whether it's sort of equality in this area or that area. In one time it was, well, the victims don't get a say. Then to redress that, victim impact statements, but having seen it and experienced it from the pointy end, not so much myself, but listening to victim impact statements that other guys there were showing to me, it was a complete overswing. And you know, when are we going to find the middle ground again, and so that it's, you know, there's equality on both sides?
Yeah. You want to comment about that, Faye?
When I started visiting Henry, I found that the prisoners who prior to that were just labelled, from my point of view, inmate or prisoner, all had a human face, they all had a human element, and that changed my view of those people dramatically.
Excellent.
And that's such an important point to remember. But we're going to say goodbye to Faye right now. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Faye, for coming on.
Thank you for
And
having
we're
me.
going to welcome back Dr. Moles right after this break.
The use of timber in your home creates a warmth that can't be surpassed by any other material. Solid timber complements almost every texture and colour. Let Limex Timber show you the warmth of Australian oak, the richness of real Baltic pine, the strength of Jarrah, or the soft look of Tasmanian oak. In flooring, stairs, furniture or fireplaces, nothing can come close to the look of natural solid timber from Limex. Limex, the solid timber specialists. Bedford Street, Port Adelaide.
The Burning Question with your host Pamela Segneri and Paul Tothill.
Welcome back, Dr. Moles. We're here with Henry Keogh, Paul Tothill and myself, and we're still asking the question, is justice really justice? So I'm going to throw it open to whoever wants to dive in and tidy this all up for me.
Henry, perhaps if I can ask you a question. I mean, obviously in your journey for your pursuit of justice, a 20-year journey, you did have help on the way.
Sure.
Are there others that you're aware of in the system that don't have access to that same kind of help? Could there be other examples besides yours within the South Australian system?
Well, I know for a fact that there are. There were guys who didn't have people like I was blessed to have sort of fighting in my corner for me. They have nothing. They're a lone voice against a typhoon. No one hears them, no one's interested in them, and the system certainly isn't.
On that, what is the sense of your well-being when you lament in that kind of vacuum?
It takes a toll. Some people will just turn into themselves. They'll lose hope, they'll become despondent and even depressed. And then some will start to either act out, self-harm, or even take their own life.
Do you think from your perspective that is helpful in a rehabilitative model to be able to reintroduce these people, often long-term prisoners, back into the community?
Oh, of course. They were a member of society and the community before they went in. They still have family in most cases and loved ones who do time just as much as the prisoners, sometimes more so. When they go back, they're going to come back as a damaged individual if they've had no through care until the last moment, if then. And then you have the society at large. They also have to bear the consequences of a system that has done nothing to help them rehabilitate themselves, improve themselves. What are they going to do when they come back?
So if there's some kind of disconnect
Yeah.
in the sentencing rehabilitation system to them being people being restored back into society, that's not going to help our idea of justice in the end, is it?
No. If they feel abandoned and there is no connection there, they find it very hard to relate again to other humans at a normal level.
How difficult have you found it to readjust to being in the community again after serving 20 years in prison?
It's mixed, but by and large, it was easier than I imagined it was going to be. I think what helped enormously was the fact that because of all the work that had been done through Bob, other people who were working my case, the media in terms of the documentary, or not documentaries, but the shows and that have been put on by a number of stations. It helped re-educate people and open their minds to the fact that they hadn't been given the whole story or even half the truth. And consequently, they were prepared and much more welcoming than I'd expected. And that helped an awful lot.
Excellent. So, Dr. Moles, where do we go from here? We know there is examples, potentially you suggest there are examples within the South Australian system, and I'm sure that would be other jurisdictions as well. What value do we place then on the innocent being dealt with accordingly, with the presumption of innocence, and what value do you think we ought to preserve around that? In other words, what more can we do?
Look, it's very important if you have any system at all that you have some process of audit to simply check that the system's working properly.
Yep.
And we do it within any office system and with any banking system and with all the other social systems that we have. So why wouldn't you have it within your justice system? But funnily enough, we don't have an effective system of audit there. Yes, we do have an appeal, but often, in many cases, they don't work so well as we would like them to.
They don't happen voluntarily, do they, Bob?
No.
It basically has to be pushed for and enforced on them.
Yeah, so we're actually expecting the system, the legal system, to be self-critical. What we need is an independent body that would actually have access to the relevant information and be able to review that. So in Britain, they have the Criminal Review Commission. The Criminal Review Commission has a statutory right of access to any documents or any materials held by any public and now any private body. They can walk into the DPP's office or to the police or any other people involved with the justice system and demand to see their files and access them and make sure that things have been done correctly. In Britain, they've identified, as we said, 420 cases where people have been wrongly convicted, and this has been supported by the Court of Criminal Appeal in overturning the convictions. Whatever's said and done is that we do have cases of unrecognised miscarriages of justice in Australia, in all states and territories, And we need a system that will enable us to identify those and deal with them properly. So it's all right having a new right of appeal, as we have, but if the people don't have any right to access the information that can help them to identify precisely what it was that went wrong with their trial, what's the point in just giving them a new right of appeal?
I think there's too much of a defensive stance right across society.
Yeah.
And I can understand it because our natural inclination is to fix the blame. What we should be doing is fixing the problem, not looking for a head to stick on a pike. He did it, or you know, he's responsible for this mess up. Let's attack the issues. You know, so it's like when you're bringing up a child, you confront the behaviour. You don't attack them personally. You get a much better outcome. And if the system, for instance, if it feels as though it's under attack, what does it do? It closes ranks.
Yes.
And then you get cover-ups, and then that cascades to more cover-ups and a bigger miscarriage.
Some people watching might say, well, really, in the scheme of everything, you're talking about a very small percentage in the context of how many criminal cases there are per annum, how many people plead guilty, how many people go to trial. We're talking about a very small percentage. What's your view? Is one too many?
Well, let's put it this way. All of the international studies would show us that the rate of miscarriages of justice must be at least 2%. Now, that sounds like a very small number. In Australia, that would translate to around 600 wrongful convictions. If you happen to be just one of those, then your life has been devastated and the life of your family has been devastated. And the people who are part of your community have also learnt to distrust the legal system. You multiply that 100 times, 200 times, and it's not good for our society to lose that sense of confidence in the criminal justice system. So it's not just the percentages, it's the experiences that we're inflicting upon people unnecessarily. And a system of audit, whatever that costs, would have to be less than the cost of actually keeping people in prison who ought not to be there.
What about our value system? I mean, if we say we're a people that of fairness and justice, is one too many? Henry?
Of course it is, especially if, as Bob said, you're one of them, or you are a family member of one of those. You know, just picking up on the issue of people who will plead guilty, not everyone who pleads guilty is necessarily guilty. So in America, you have a raft of people who are uneducated and they're languishing in a system that is overtaxed and broken. And so to short-circuit it all, they will cop a plea, because they've got a plea bargain system over there, and get a significantly reduced certainty, let's say 2, 3 or 5 years versus 20, 30 or life. Now, that is a no-brainer. And I know from talking to prisoners here, they just get worn down by the system and they will plead and get the 20% discount and have it done with.
Yeah.
That's scary, isn't it?
So they're not necessarily guilty just because they put a plea in.
So there's lots more we need to be able to do on this topic. There's lots more we could say on this topic. And hopefully we'll have enough viewer interaction that we can get you back on, Henry, and we can continue to talk about these topics. So thank you very much, Dr. Mole. Thank you, Henry Keogh. Thank you, Pam.
Thank you, Paul. And if you'd like to comment, go to our Facebook page and leave us a comment, because we'd love to hear from you. This is The Burning Question, and we'll see you next time.